The Bogey Hole. Written by Stories from the Attic. Narrated by McConnell. Of course, when it came to the kids, we all knew what had happened to Danny. It was simple. Joey Loam had got him. We never really talked about it amongst ourselves, and we certainly never mentioned it to the adults, but we all knew. Joey Loam had got him and taken him back to the Bogey Hole. The Marston Council estate where I grew up was, to put it into a single word, grim. To put it into 2 words, bloody grim. And into 4, bloody grim and boring. Like many council estates, the overall impression given off by the place, or by the buildings at least, was one of an all-encompassing grey. An endless maze of concrete, pebble dash, and banality. It was not, in short, the sort of place you'd expect to find a monster. Still, behind the rows of uniform fences, double-glazed windows, and cookie-cutter gardens, there existed the thing that elevates all estates above the dankness of the provision, the people. And, as always, where there are people, there are stories. One story, one we told ourselves often, was meant to make us feel better. It was also meant to be true. You know the one. It's the one that says, the more urban we become, the less scared we need to be. As if all of the dark things can be chased away with bulldozers, and that by replacing trees with concrete or candlelight with street lamps, we can somehow pave over those other, more sinister stories, the ones that keep us awake at night and make our flesh crawl. There are no ghosts in a city, we tell ourselves. No demons in a car park. But these are adult stories. Children are more truthful. In every corner of every playground in these supposedly modern times, stories of the darker things still creep and slither up through the cracks in the paving like persistent weeds. The whispers and rumors of things that smile in the dark lurk and fester just as much as they ever did. Even council estates, it seems, have their monsters. The fable and folklore passed between kids is as raw and terrifying as it had ever been. For them, there doesn't need to be a gingerbread house or a creepy old wood. The setting doesn't matter. All they need is a story. A first-hand account from a friend of a friend. A kernel of truth, nurtured by hearsay, which can grow into a tale that would chill the blood of most adults. The Bogey Hole story chills me, but then of course it would, because I know that it's true. Apparently, or at least according to my parents, in the north of England where I was brought up, the phrase bogey hole was a fairly innocent term, and basically just another name for the coal hole or coal shed. Now, I know what you're thinking. That's not a very helpful definition, particularly because most people nowadays don't have the first clue what a coal hole or coal shed is, and explaining one unknown thing by comparing it to another unknown thing is a bit stupid. Allow me to explain. Again, according to my folks, a coal hole, back in the days of yore when my parents were young and dinosaurs still roamed the earth, was basically a recess or a gap under the stairs, or in some cases a small cupboard by the front door, where the coal man, the man charged with delivering sacks of the black stuff necessary for keeping the fire lit, would dump your portion of coal when he delivered it to your door every few days. Think of it as somewhere Harry Potter might be forced to sleep, only instead of being occupied by an irritating prepubescent wizard, it was full of coal. Of course, having grown up in the noughties rather than in the greyish-brown Dickensian nightmare that seems to have been my parents' childhood, I, like most people hearing or reading this, was decades from a time when we needed coal to heat our homes. I had never even heard the phrase coal hole until my mother happened to mention it, and the closest my friends and I ever got to seeing a coal man was bumping into that crazy guy from the next town over who called himself Coal Man and thought he was a rapper because he wore a puffer jacket and a backward baseball cap. I had, however, heard of a bogey hole, though for my friends and I that phrase had a very different and far less innocent meaning. For us, the bogey hole referred not to the space under the stairs or an area for the depositing of fuel, but to one very particular location, specifically the small green door adjacent to the entrance of a council house on the Marston estate and the space that lay just behind it. Crammed under the porch and at a right angle to the front entrance, the door had once been green, as evinced by the last remnants of paint still clinging stubbornly to the faded wood like moss on a fallen tree. Now, though, it would probably be more accurately described as grey or faded brown, stripped as it was by time and the elements of its previous coat, and never repainted. The house itself, 19 Mouselow Croft, was of no particular interest to us. It had been boarded up for years. Looking back, it probably would have made more sense for the thread of our childhood folklore to be wound around that empty shell of a building. After all, it was abandoned, boarded up, and a bit spooky-looking. But for whatever reason, it wasn't. Instead, the stories and urban myths that kept us awake at night came not from the house itself, but from that tiny door. From the bogey hole. The door, we knew, led to a storage cupboard. A small, windowless cement room, like a cell, around 4 feet square and 6 feet high. We knew this because almost every other house on the row, every house on the estate, and indeed a few of our own houses had one. My house had one. In our house, we called it the shed, and despite it being about as shed-like in appearance as I am, it did serve a similar purpose to a shed. It was closed on 3 sides by cement walls, and, just like the bogey hole, sported a wooden door at the front. Our so-called shed was pretty much a mini carless garage, and served as a dumping ground for any and all varieties of crap that we didn't want taking up space in the house. Ours was crammed with gardening tools, half-used pots of paint, my mother's treasured but never used weight bench, and a host of other domestic detritus, not to mention a ton of stuff that my dad wanted to keep because he insisted it might one day come in handy. Though, of course, it never did. The bogey hole on Mouselow was, in reality, just another of these sheds, and in the bright, warmthless sunshine of an autumn morning, passing it on our way to school, it was almost possible to dismiss it as just a shed, or even just a coal hole. Almost, but not quite. Why, then, you might ask, was this particular cubby hole on a normal, albeit boarded-up council house, on a normal, albeit painfully boring council estate, so different? The first answer is simple. The peephole. Around 3.5 feet from the ground, too low for most adults to be able to use without bending down, was a small, circular peephole of the kind that people had in the days before CCTV, to allow them to look out from inside their house and see who was calling. Why the former owners of the house would have chosen to put a peephole into this door that led only to a storage cupboard was a mystery that fascinated our young minds. Looking back now, there was probably a simple explanation. The original door might have been damaged, and when looking around for a door with which to replace it, the council or the owners hadn't been too worried about where it came from. In their haste to get it fixed, they had simply used the first door that had come along, second-hand from some other house. A door which in previous life had been someone else's front door, was quickly recycled and installed as their shed door, peephole and all. Simple. That would explain it. Though, of course, such mundane explanations never presented themselves to us as kids. What made the presence of the peephole creepy for us was not just its strange location and height from the ground, but the fact that it was positioned in such a way as to look inward. For anyone inside the bogey hole, the lens would have been quite useless. They could not have looked out through it to see who was coming, or what manner of caller was unexpectedly rapping at their chamber door in the middle of the night. Its only possible use was for someone standing on the outside to peer through and see what was inside. Though, of course, none of us were ever brave enough to check. The second answer and the second unnerving thing about the hole was the locks. Whereas the entire rest of the house was open to the elements and had stood doorless and empty for as long as any of us could remember, which sort of defeated the purpose of having boarded up windows, the bogey hole was not only closed, but was, as my dad would put it, shut up good and proper. There were not one, but 3 clasps, all with huge padlocks attached to the door, at the bottom, the middle, and the top. There were 2 key-turned locks and a bolt lock that disappeared into the ground at the foot of the door, also fastened with a padlock. Clearly, someone had gone to great lengths to either keep people out or, we reasoned, to keep something in. It was the latter possibility that gave birth to the urban myth, the one that haunted my teenage years and which, until that day with Danny, kept me far away from that peephole. The story, as it was told to me, is similar in some ways to many ritual or bravery games. Anyone who has stopped short of saying Bloody Mary or Candyman into a mirror for a 5th time will know exactly what I'm talking about. In our version, the dare was to walk up slowly, to crouch down at the appropriate height, and take a look through the peephole to see what was inside. In all likelihood, the answer was nothing, or at least nothing that would be visible, considering that it would be dark inside and the peephole would be covered in decades' worth of dust. But, of course, that didn't matter. What did matter was what was supposed to be inside. According to the story, the reason the Mouselow house had stood empty for as long as it had was because the family that had lived there had suffered a series of tragedies. 2 of the family's 3 boys had disappeared in mysterious circumstances and, according to some, were snatched right out of their beds. The 3rd and surviving brother, a man whose name changed every time depending upon who was telling the story, apparently said that days before his youngest brother went missing, he had come into the house one evening crying his eyes out, saying that something had spoken to him from inside the bogey hole. He said that as he walked up to the door at dusk, he had heard something shifting and moving around inside. At first, he had stopped dead and stayed quiet, waiting to see if the noise would come again. Whether perhaps he had been mistaken or had in fact made the noise himself without realizing. Waiting, stock still, he stared at the peeling but still green paint, listening for the sound. When it failed to come, he felt relieved and continued towards the front door, only for the sound, louder the second time, to come again. He froze. The boy had been a little unnerved by the sound, but also a little curious. Perhaps, he thought, it was an animal, a cat or a bird that had become trapped inside. Turning back toward the tiny door, he had looked around himself, behind and along the narrow deserted streets of tarmacked roads and graffiti-tagged walls, and noticed that the streetlights had flickered on. A few were still red, as they always were at first, whilst the bulbs warmed up, but the rest were a garish orange, a colour that matched the shade of flame, but which gave off no warmth. He noticed also how still and eerily quiet it had become. The boy, his brother said, had suddenly given up his curiosity and begun to feel uneasy. Suddenly, the mild excitement raised by the idea of finding an animal he might be allowed to nurse back to health had disappeared, and he had instead begun to think, for what reason he could never have explained, that if there were an animal in there, if it was a cat or a bird, then it was probably not only hurt, but being hurt deliberately. For, suddenly, though he did not know why, perhaps it was some faint tingle of instinct, something in him had switched, and he had begun to feel very wary, and perhaps even slightly afraid of that door and whatever might be shifting and moving behind it. There was a part of him that had wanted to just forget about it, to burst into the house, the warmth, and the light as quickly as possible, but instead he remained rooted to the spot and staring at flakes of peeling paint and the small glass peephole, like some dark, shiny pebble right in the middle, as black in this light as the pupil of an eye. Finally, he stepped backward and, reassured that nobody would see this act of cowardice, he decided to step off the small path altogether, intending to move around the small bush and get to the front door without passing in front of the tiny door at all. He weaved cautiously around the shrubs, stepping onto and through the mud, and had almost placed his foot on the front step, when he heard the voice. A strained, tattered, almost stringy voice that, low and soft, whispered to him from just behind or perhaps beneath the door. It was a voice that did not shout, scream, or rage, but which instead seemed to curl and slither out from under the door, the way smoke might enter a room, pouring in silken curls beneath the crack. That voice, the boy said, had spoken to him by name, and had told him that one night when he was tucked up in bed and the room was dark, Joey Loam would come for him, to take him away and eat him. At the time, they'd just laughed at him, at his silly little fears. "Imagine," the older brother had said, "being 9 years old and still scared of the dark." In reality, he hadn't had to imagine much, because at 9 years old he had still been scared himself, though of course he'd never have admitted it. Young boys never do. Instead, they pretend until they convince themselves. Were anyone to ask a 10-year-old boy if he believed in monsters, the answer would always be no. The same if you suggested he might be afraid of the dark. In most cases, the boy would puff out his chest, raise up to his full height, and dismiss such talk as stupid and babyish. Admitting to such things would be ridiculous. But that doesn't mean they're not true. It doesn't mean that those same boys do not snatch the blankets up and pull them over their heads when they're alone, when the floorboards creak or the wind forces the branch of a tree to lightly scratch at the windows. It doesn't mean that those boys won't insist that the cupboard door be shut before they'd even think of lying down for sleep, or that they won't sprint between rooms when the space between is in darkness. As children get older, the fears still remain. They just get easier to hide. When the 2 snatchings happened, when his brothers disappeared, the eldest brother, the one who was spared, was said to have noticed on both occasions how the door to that bogey hole had been open, just a crack. That was part of the myth, just as the peephole was. According to the story, if you looked through the peephole, you'd see Joey Loam staring back, and worse than that, he would see you too. What exactly Joey Loam was, why he lived in the bogey hole, and even what he looked like, was never explained, but then I suppose that's common with bogeymen. Their power lies in the fact that they aren't fully formed or seen. Somehow, the fact that they're blurred around the edges, indistinct and maybe imagined differently by each child, seems to make it worse. Perhaps because somewhere in the dim light of our distant past, the predators were never fully formed or seen clearly, their forms were only suggested. Those things that fed on men were only seen in full by those who didn't live to talk about it. Their forms built in fragments by the howls from the forest or the claw that marks in the cave. They, like the bogeyman, were never seen in full. They were the teeth in the night. I don't even remember if we discussed it. Was Joey Loam a man, a monster, or both? Was he bald and thin, with pale white skin and long, slender fangs like a deep-sea fish, or perhaps huge and covered in fur like a werewolf or a man crossed with a bat? Was he a scarecrow, with fetid cabbage breath, mouldering fingers, and tattered sackcloth clothes that hung from him in strands? These questions were never answered. That was left to your imagination. I think the closest anyone ever came to pinning down a picture of Joey Loam was an image someone sprayed onto a brick wall by the shops. It was a simple thing, the kind of drawing a child might do in crayon, but it was sprayed in a horrible, raging red. The picture itself was basically just a circle, oddly skewed with two filled-in globes of red for eyes and a mouth made up of triangle teeth. Again, it wasn't detailed or even very good, yet somehow it formed a frame, a skeletal base onto which the flesh of each individual's version could be draped and hung. Under this strange face, the anonymous artist had written in blocked capital letters, "Joey Loam is coming home." I think the image was only there for 2 weeks. One of the shop owners, or maybe the council, cleaned it off without a thought, only for it to be replaced a week or two later by some football slogan or lewd word, that wall being, as some walls are, cursed to be forever covered in paint. But for every child on that estate, every kid who had caught a glimpse on their way to the shops or the chippy on a Friday night, that simple image, sadly, stayed forever. To this day I have no idea who painted it, nor do I have any idea where the name Joey Loam came from, or how long it had been used on the estate. I don't know why that particular door was christened the Bogey Hole, nor do I know why the kids in our area had decided that this man, or whatever it was, lived inside there. These things, it seems, these myths, have a habit of simply appearing, growing, and spreading like thick black mold in damp-ridden houses. One thing I did know, however, one thing I knew with dead, awful certainty, was that if you dared to look through that peephole, then that night Joey Loam would follow you home. There was even a song or a nursery rhyme about it, a horrible, discordant melody with the words, "Joey Loam's comin' home to eat your meat and chew your bones." He'd find you by the smell of your meat and wait beneath your bed. Then, in the night, when everything was quiet and black, he'd reach his claws from under there and take you, drag you back to the bogey hole, and chew upon your bones. Writing it now, it sounds stupid. We were 12 years old, virtually teenagers. We shouldn't have been scared by bogeymen and all that nonsense. But we were. Not one of us would dare to look through that peephole, and even though we teased and cajoled each other about it, even though we dared one another to go up and have a look, somehow it always got dropped before any of us actually did. The closest any of us would get was running up to touch the door, and even then we'd be filling our pants by the time we sprinted back. All over a stupid myth and a little door. Still, after what happened with Danny, I think we had a right to be scared. Danny was, in a weird way, an outsider, a cocky, brash, and sometimes irritating kid. He'd come from another school and only moved to the estate about 3 months earlier. Because of that, he hadn't grown up with the stories and mythology that we had. To him, our spooky stories, ingrained since birth, meant nothing. He thought Joey Loam was hilarious, and used to tease me and my friends about it mercilessly. "Ooh," he'd say. "Is Joey Loam, the big bad bogeyman, going to get you, eat you like a penny chew, you big mard-asses?" When he said stuff like that, I'll admit I did feel embarrassed and even a little ashamed. It was ridiculous that we still hung on to our childhood fears and let those ghost stories linger. Part of me wanted to admit it, to tell him he was right, and that we all knew there was probably nothing behind that door but cobwebs, dust, and a rusty old lawn-mower. I knew, deep down, in the end that was probably true and that I should just say so. But I never did, and I still never went up. Still never looked through that peephole or touched the Bogey hole's door. I would never have dared. But Danny did. One November night, about a week after Halloween, when the air was still foggy from the bonfire night smoke, we were walking home from the school bus and happened to pass the house on Mouselow. We passed it every night, and, before Danny had arrived, made a concerted effort just to ignore it, sometimes making our conversations louder or crossing the street with big gestures to avoid going near or mentioning it. If we were on our own, we would sprint past it and never mention it to anyone. With Danny, though, things were different. We couldn't just ignore it or walk past as if it didn't bother us, because we had made the mistake early on of being honest, of letting him in on our own local folklore in the misguided belief that he'd buy into it. He didn't. Instead, he brought up the subject or pointed to the door with every opportunity he got. This day was no different. As soon as we came close, he started needling us about being scared of the Bogey hole, reminding us loudly about how wet we were for being scared of bogies and monsters. I said nothing, as usual, but eventually my friend Mark, getting a bit cheesed off by Danny's insults, turned the dare back on him, suggesting that if he was really so brave, perhaps he should take up the challenge, walk up to the door, bend to the peephole, and look through. I remember standing there, the sun long set and the street lit by the sickly orange glow from the streetlight, and feeling my bowels tighten. For a second, I couldn't believe what Mark was saying. I knew, of course, that in the real world there are no monsters. Such a dare was just a stupid game. But in our world, where I knew damn well that Mark would never have dared approach that door, asking someone else to do it was dangerous. Ice swilled in my belly. It wasn't even me going up there. Wasn't me going to the door, and yet I still felt it, the tightening in my chest, the gripping ache of anticipation, the feeling, unmistakably, of fear. I watched, horrified, as Danny sauntered cockily up to the door, as he turned and grimaced, making stupid faces as he went up the long path toward the boarded house, along the garden footpath, and toward the front door. I watched as he came to stop before the Bogey hole, watched as he bent slowly forward to finally look through the hole. I watched, and I remember, I was terrified for him. For a second I considered shouting at him, telling him to stop and give up, that we were wrong, that we admitted we were cowards, and we didn't want him to go through with it. But I didn't. Instead, I stood close to Mark, both of us watching breathlessly as Danny bent almost double, so he looked like an upside-down L, as he placed one hand on the door and with a slow, deliberate motion gently bent his arms and held his eye to the hole. For a moment, there was hush. A horrible, aching silence. Leaves skittered by, and several streets away, a girl laughed with her friend. Then, back to the quiet. Danny didn't move. He just stood there, bent forward, staring for what seemed like an age. After about 30 seconds, Mark called up to Danny, asking him what he saw. Danny never answered. Without saying a word, he straightened up and turned around to face us. His eyes were wider than any I have ever seen, the whites visible all around as he glared in terror forward and out. At his crotch I could see a large damp stain where he'd wet himself. I began to move toward him, to ask him what he had seen, to check that he was okay, but I never got the chance. Before I had taken 2 steps, Danny had turned his back and run. It was the last time either of us ever saw him. Danny had made it home, that much we know. He had spoken briefly to his dad, drank his tea, and watched telly until about 8 o'clock, during which time his dad said afterward he hardly said a word. When he had finally asked him if there was something wrong, Danny had shaken his head but hadn't said a word. His dad did notice, however, that every few minutes Danny would look toward the window, out into the deserted street and the dark that pressed heavily against the glass, looking out as if he expected someone. Eventually, his dad had to leave for his shift at work. He had kissed Danny on the forehead, told him to be in bed by 9, and left, locking the door behind him. He left the spare key in a small dish by the door. He also left Danny alone. Around 8:30 p.m. that night, I got a phone call from Danny, or at least a call was made. I had gotten my first mobile phone for Christmas the year before, and when I answered it at that hour of the night, my parents had looked at me sternly, silently warning me that whoever was calling had better make it quick because I was due in bed within the hour. As it turned out, the call was over in seconds. Lifting the receiver to my ear, I listened carefully and even called Danny's name a few times. Then, leaving the room so that my parents couldn't hear, I remember whispering to him, asking if he was okay. I told him that it was all right about the bogey hole, that we wouldn't tell anyone about his accident, and that we could keep it between the three of us. Still, there was no answer. Then the line went dead. Obviously, when Danny's dad came home the next morning to find the house empty, he panicked. He called the police and, as the last of his friends to see him, we were asked to talk to them. We told him what we'd done that day and answered their questions. Questions about his mood, about whether he was being bullied, how he had seemed when we left him, and whether he had mentioned going anywhere. We answered all of their questions, but some parts we left out. We never mentioned the bogey hole. Never told them that Danny had looked through the peephole, then run away. That whatever he had seen on the other side of that door had scared him so badly that he'd wet himself. We didn't say that he had tried to call, that maybe he'd wanted to ask for help, or to say that he was scared, or maybe that though his father had left, he felt as if he wasn't alone. We never said a word. Because what would have been the point? They wouldn't have believed us, even if we'd told them. Just as they wouldn't have believed what both Mark and I had noticed walking past the bogey hole on that cold autumn morning the next day, when both of us had looked, terrified, to our right and seen that every single lock that had been fastened to the wood was broken, and that the door of the bogey hole was open, just a crack. This has been The Bogey Hole, written by Stories from the Attic, narrated by Robin McConnell. Copyright 2023 by Michael Vandervoort. Production copyright by Michael Vandervoort. The Birthday Girl. A short horror story. Written by Stories from the Attic. Narrated by Robin McConnell. For almost the first full year that I worked with Doris, I mistakenly referred to her as Dora. Not that this was entirely my fault, you understand. The name, printed on the rota, which was itself neatly pinned to my clipboard on my first day, clearly said Dora. In fact, the rota continued to insist upon incorrectly naming her for the entire time that I worked at the Marbrook Grove retirement home, even after I had realized the mistake and informed the office about it. Then, of course, there was Dora, or should I say Doris, herself. Of course, she had noticed almost immediately that I was referring to her by the wrong name, but never bothered to correct me. She, having decided that in the grand scheme of things Dora was close enough, found that it was actually amusing to watch me get it wrong every day for months. Rather than saying anything, Doris instead just played along, hoping to see how long it took me to realize my mistake. I remember it was a morning in April that I first realized, and even then it took a minute for the penny to drop. I had picked up Doris's mail from the central letterbox, which was basically a collection of pigeonholes just inside the main doors, with the numbers of each resident's flat on the top. The care staff, as we were known, would go each morning and pick up any mail that was sent to the residents under their care and take them to their individual flat. Just to explain, Marbrook Grove was what we in Britain call sheltered accommodation. It's basically an old folks' home, but each resident has their own little warden-controlled flat. Each flat has a bedroom, living room, bathroom, and kitchen to allow the resident a degree of independence, whilst also being under the same roof as other folks of the same age in a single retirement community. All of the flats have red emergency cords in every room for the residents to pull and call to the warden if they have any difficulties or need help. Some residents do live quite independently, especially at first, but as time goes on, the care staff are there to visit and help with things and look after people as their health and well-being deteriorates with age. Sometimes this would involve bathing or dressing the resident. Other times it was cooking and cleaning for them or attending to their personal needs with things like medication. When I first started at Marbrook, I had 3 residents directly under my care, a fella named Tom, a younger lass named Sue, whom I hardly saw, and Doris, who I thought was named Dora. Anyway, on the day I discovered my mistake, I had taken an unusually large crop of correspondence out from Doris's pigeonhole and had carried it to her flat for her morning visit. I usually dropped in on Doris 3 times a day to prepare her meals. Taking the additional letters meant carrying Doris's mail in 2 hands. Her delivery was always a large one because of all the papers. Usually the only thing in Doris's pigeonhole was the collection of daily news she had delivered every day. At least 6 different newspapers every single day. On a Sunday, which this was, these papers came with additional inserts and supplements like magazines and TV guides, so carrying them all under one arm was somewhat difficult, especially when you had letters to carry as well. By the time I got to Doris's and plopped the pile of papers down onto the coffee table, I was a little flustered, having almost dropped the papers twice as I struggled to keep all the bump sandwiched inside where it was supposed to be. Wishing her good morning, I breezed into the kitchen to brew up some tea and told her she had a few letters. Lifting the first, something from the council about making sure she voted, I laughed and commented about how they had gotten her name mixed up. "They've called you Doris on this one," I remember saying with a laugh. "They want you to vote for them, but they can't even get your name right. Funny, isn't it?" Doris smiled. She clearly found it very funny indeed. Turning over the second letter, which was in a lovely yellow envelope, I remember being surprised to see that the name on the front was again Doris. For a second I worried that I had picked up someone else's mail by mistake. "Well, blow me, this one says Doris as well. That's not your real name." I was about to say, "Is it?" but saw from Dora's toothy grin that I already had my answer. "Your name is Doris? Doris, and you've been letting me call you Dora all this time?" Doris only smiled. "Not my fault you can't read proper, you barmy sod," she laughed. "I wouldn't have told you at all. It were funnier watching you get it wrong." She laughed as I returned the smile and gently swatted at her with the yellow envelope. "Fancy not letting on all that time," I said as she roared with laughter. "Anyway, do you want me to read this to you or not?" Doris wiped a tear from her eye. "Are you sure it's for me? It's got some other bleeder's name on it." I shot her a withering look, hooked my finger under the fold of the envelope, and tore it open. As soon as the card came out, there was a sudden and abrupt change in Doris, as if a guillotine blade had fallen across the room, separating the light-hearted laughter that had been there just a few moments before from a deadly, serious present. "It's a birthday card. You never said it was—" The card did read Happy Birthday on the front, though the inside was completely blank.
"It's not. It can't be. I mean, I've checked it and checked. What's the date? The date today. The date."
She spat the words at me like daggers, jabbing and plunging their sharp points at me in her pressing haste for an answer. The 12th, I think. Why?" I replied, checking the date at the top of one of the newspapers. Doris clutched at her chest in relief, in a motion that for a second made me worry she might be having a heart attack.
"It's early, then. The card's early. Honestly, for a second there I thought I'd gotten it wrong."
"So it's not your birthday, then? Not yet, anyway." Doris looked away, turning her entire, tiny body to look out of the net-curtained window, and answered simply, "No." Then she turned and out of nowhere told me to go.
"Listen, I can manage today. You've put the kettle on and I'm not hungry this morning. Come back at lunchtime. I don't need you here hovering about the place like a lost wasp."
She raised both hands, fragile, with paper-thin skin and a protruding network of deep blue veins raised across the back, to shoo me out of the door.
"And another thing. Today's Monday. I don't want anyone coming in here on Wednesday, okay?"
I looked at her, confused. Her sudden shifts in mood were concerning, but not as worrying as her suggestion that nobody come to see her. "I'm not sure about that, Doris. I've got rounds on Wednesday and I'm down to see you 3 times that day, so I'll be here."
"Are you Mutton Jeff?"
"Sorry?"
"Deaf, cloth ears. Are you deaf?"
Doris asked aggressively.
"I've told you once and I'll not tell you again. I don't want anyone at all, in this flat on Wednesday. Do you understand me?"
She tutted and adjusted the blanket she had draped over her knees.
"This is supposed to be independent living. Fair enough. For one day in the year, Wednesday, I want my bit of my own independence, all right? So nobody comes in. Just leave me be."
I sighed and shrugged, knowing that this request was likely not going to go down well with management. "Thing is, we need to give you your meals and—"
"What? You can't just make me a batty the day before and put it in the fridge? Leave me some crackers or some crisps or something."
Now I was beginning to become frustrated. Doris had never bristled up like this before, and, whilst her acting out of character was a little concerning and certainly something I would note on my end-of-shift report, her tone was also beginning to annoy me. Usually, Doris and I got on well. I often stayed for longer than scheduled in her flat, and over the course of almost 12 months, we had become very close. She had a wicked sense of humour, and we usually laughed a lot, more than with any of my other residents. In fact, it wouldn't be wrong to say that Doris was easily my favourite resident that I'd ever worked with. Now, though, she was being obstinate, belligerent, and not a little rude. I busied myself by carrying some of the dishes from the previous night's dinner into the kitchen adjoining where we were and placed them in the sink. "So just sandwiches the whole day, then? You're going to survive on that from morning till night, are you?" I asked, with what I'll admit was a somewhat patronising tone.
"Yes, I bloody well will. I won't starve."
"And what kind of carer would I be if I left you with just that all day? They'll be ringing social services to report me at this rate." I smiled, trying to laugh off her suggestion and make something of a joke out of it, but the old woman was like a dog with a bone. She'd set her stubborn old mind to this, and now she was going to stick with it.
"Don't be so marred," she replied sternly. "Wouldn't be the first time I've just had a butty for my tea. I'll be right. You make the sandwiches, bring 'em with you tomorrow, and that'll do me till Thursday. Nobody's going to be doing any complaining, any road. I've no family to do any complaining, not no more."
Having washed and put away the plate and cutlery, I wandered back into the living room where Doris was sitting, as usual in her armchair by the window. Strolling over to her, I squatted at the coffee table she kept by her elbow, intending to retrieve her teacup and give it a rinse before I refreshed her tea. As I bent down, I tried, perhaps a little too flippantly, to overrule her and bring the ridiculous conversation to an end. "Listen, I'm not leaving you with just sandwiches for a whole day, so you can forget it and I'll see you on Wednesday just the same as—" Suddenly, Doris lashed out, swiping at the teacup I'd come to collect with the back of her hand, sending cold tea spraying all over my uniform as the cup itself was sent hurtling across the room, where it smashed against the far wall.
"Listen to me, you daft cow. I've told you once and I'll not tell you again. You're not coming here on Wednesday, right? Not you, not the warden, not the Pope. Nobody. You understand? Nobody. This is my house and I say who comes in it."
Straightening up and breathing deeply to control my emotions, I steadied myself and slowly but deliberately wiped the tea from my face and the front of my overalls. "You want to be glad that wasn't hot, or else—"
"Or else?"
Doris spat in response.
"Or else what?"
Turning away, she waved me off with a flick of the wrist.
"Get out my sight. I don't want to see you."
"Well, I've still got—" I began to protest.
Get out! Get out! Get out!
She screeched, and, backing slowly toward the door, I left her there still fuming. As I left, I closed the door quietly behind me. As anyone who has worked in care will tell you, irrational and sometimes violent outbursts are par for the course when working with the elderly, particularly when working with those for whom dementia, senility, or some other form of diminished mental capacity is an issue. For Doris, as far as I knew, it wasn't an issue, and yet, over the course of a 10-minute conversation, my favourite service user had suddenly turned into a raving lunatic who didn't want me in her flat. I decided to see my other residents and then report the incident to the warden, a woman named Claire, with whom I had established quite a friendly working relationship. My intention wasn't to tell on Doris, but just to make the warden aware of what had happened and to record it, in case the incident was the first symptom of a problem and Doris would require some additional attention in the coming days, whether she wanted it or not. At the end of my shift, I went to the warden's office to find that Claire wasn't there. Instead, another, younger woman named Bex informed me that she was taking over the call duty as Claire was out, and that if I had something to record, I should put a record in the shift notes for the other carers and put it in the folder. Usually, though, there was another member of staff signed up to deliver Doris's tea. I would swap with them and take it down myself so I could spend a bit more time with her and so she had someone familiar coming in throughout the day. On that night, though, I decided against it. As Bex seemed far more interested in watching Love Island on her phone than she did in hearing about Doris's outburst, and since someone else had been rostered to sort Doris's evening meal that day, I decided to make the note in the log as suggested and speak to Claire about it personally the following day. Once I'd written up what had happened, I packed up my stuff and went home. No sooner had I gotten on the bus and taken my seat than my mobile rang. It was Priyanka, one of the other carers at the home. For a second, I panicked. Priyanka would never usually call me during a shift, and I knew from my brief glance at the roster that she was scheduled to give Doris her meal that night. When I answered the phone, however, it wasn't Priyanka, but Doris on the other end of the line. She explained that she felt terrible about earlier, and that when I hadn't turned up to do her tea that night, she had asked Priyanka if she could borrow her phone to ring me.
"Listen, love, I'm sorry about before. I get a bit wound up about birthdays, that's all. If you come see me tomorrow morning, I'll explain. I don't want you to go home with a cob on, all mad at me." She paused, and then with her voice lowered to an almost whisper, added, "You're my favourite here. You know that." "Hey!" I could hear Priyanka braying in mock outrage. "Oh, shush you. It's true. You're more like a daughter to me, and I feel terrible shouting at you. You know how it is. You always hurt the ones you love." I don't know if it was tiredness or something else, but I'll happily admit that those final words made me tear up a little. "I'm sorry. Just come and see me tomorrow, will you?"
I cleared my throat and said that I would, just as another voice broke in on the line. It was Priyanka, putting an end to the call before things got a bit too emotional.
"Right, you two, that's enough of the lovin'. She'll be here tomorrow, you can talk to her then."
Whether I was meant to be the she or the her was not quite clear.
"I'm on pay-as-you-go, this is costing me a fortune."
And with that, she hung up. The following day, I went at the usual time to Doris's flat. I let myself in and was walking into the living room when I realized that she wasn't in her usual position in the armchair by the window. In the entire time I had been working with Doris, I had never arrived before she had made it to her chair, and could count on one hand the number of times I'd seen her leave it. For a moment I was worried, until I heard her call to me from the bedroom. When I entered, I found her sitting in the straight-backed wooden chair. Before her, on the bed that separated us, were dozens of photographs, neatly laid out in rows. There looked to be around 100 of them. The ones closer to me, on my side of the bed, were black and white or sepia-toned, whilst the ones closer to her were in colour. Every single one was a person, a portrait or a candid image, but always of a single individual. There were no family shots, no snaps of scenery or of group outings. Most were only headshots. Scores of faces looked up from the bed at the beige expanse of the plastered ceiling, and now up at me. On my side of the bed there was a second wooden chair which had been set up directly opposite to where Doris was now sitting, with the bed between them. Why she had arranged them this way, as if she was having dinner across the surface of the bed with an invisible stranger seated opposite, I could not imagine. I decided not to mention the previous day's outburst and to just carry on as if nothing had happened. It was water under the bridge anyhow. "You sorting these into albums? Or just going through some old things? If you're arranging them, I can give you a lift sticking them in." I moved to approach her, in case she needed help getting around the double bed and into the living room, but she raised a hand as if to stop me. Then she pointed at the empty chair. For the first time, I started to feel a little uneasy. Something in the way Doris commanded me to sit down, and the glaring, naked emptiness of that uninhabited seat, which seemed oddly to be more vacant than empty, gave me a shiver. It was early morning when I called, but Doris hadn't bothered to open the curtains. As such, the room was dim, with only a blank wash of pale light pressing half-blocked at the window. Sitting with her back to it, her iron-grey hair illuminated in such a way that it looked like a halo of electricity, Doris seemed oddly still, as if it weren't actually her, but a waxwork figure done up to look like her, sitting on the other side of the bed. It made me think of how people look after they die, when they're laid out at the chapel of rest, caked in makeup they would never normally have worn. Lying there, cold as marble, with all the life removed. I took a seat in the chair that had clearly been put out for me and waited expectantly.
"I'm going to tell you something now, and I want you to listen. Don't say a word. You speak a single syllable and I'm going to stop talking and you'll never hear what I've got to say. Do you understand?"
I opened my mouth to say yes, but catching myself instead, nodded in response.
"Good. I've not told this to many other people, but I don't know, I felt bad about yesterday and—"
She trailed off, clearly feeling that one apology in a week was enough. Water under the bridge, I reminded myself.
"Well, I need to tell someone. These people, every single person you see here has 3 things in common. Firstly, they're all dead. Secondly, they all died on my birthday, April 14th. And finally, they all died on April 14th because I killed them."
At first, I said nothing. I had seen residents lose their marbles before, but usually the marbles disappeared slowly from the bag, one by one. They didn't get poured out and arranged onto the bed as part of some murderous delusion. I opened my mouth to ask a question, but thought better of it and decided to listen instead.
"I don't mean I killed them, like with a knife or a lead pipe in the drawing room, but I did kill them because they're the ones I thought about."
She paused and, raising one thin finger, pointed to the first photograph, a black-and-white image of a plump-looking woman with a very ancient-looking haircut.
"That's my Auntie Vi. She was an horrible woman. She used to babysit us when my parents were out, and for the fun of it she'd give us the belt and send us to bed with nought to eat, just because she felt like it. When my mum and dad saw the bruises and asked what happened, we said we'd been play fighting or we'd fallen over, but they put two and two together soon enough. Anyway, when I was 9, my mum gave us a massive cake for my birthday, with 9 candles on it and everything. She had my aunties and uncles round, including Vi, and we had a sort of party. My mum asked Vi to carry the cake in from the kitchen, and somehow she managed to drop it. My mum had saved up to buy that cake, and it was the only thing I was getting for my birthday, so she was devastated for me. Obviously, as a little girl, I was gutted and all. Eventually, the bits that could be salvaged, what could be scraped up off the floor, were put on a saucer and put in front of me. I remember it was a big mush by then, but my Auntie Vi put 1 candle in it, lit it, and told me to make a wish. In some ways, that was worse than just being in it. I remember looking at her, through her, right into the core of who she was, smiling at me with that horrible yellow-toothed grin and saying, "Can I wish for anything?" My Auntie Vi had nodded and said it could be anything as long as I didn't tell anyone. It had to be a secret. As soon as she said that, I thought of all the times me and my brothers had had to keep a secret about her and her punishments, so I wished her dead. I blew out the candle and wished that she would die, and I didn't feel the least bit sad about it. I still don't. I remember thinking to myself, well, we'll see if this wish malarkey is really true, won't we?
Doris paused and, for the first time since I'd entered the room, broke her fixed stare. Doing so, she seemed to soften, as if the wax she'd been composed of or covered in had begun to splinter and flake away, as if telling me just this part had been relief enough for her to soften. Taking a deep breath, she continued. That night she was hit by a car, which was odd because there wasn't many cars on the road back then. You had to be unlucky or a special type of stupid to get run over back then. She died before they could get her to hospital. I remember I was terrified, frightened out of my wits about what I'd done, what I at least thought I'd done. I mean, it could have been a coincidence, I suppose, but it certainly didn't feel that way to my little mind. I was scared out of my wits, but... Doris paused and, taking another deep breath to steady herself, fixed her eyes once again on mine. I was scared. I'd every right to be. But I wasn't sorry. I never told anyone what I'd wished. I had nightmares sometimes that I did tell, and then the wish got reversed. It wouldn't stop her from being killed, it would just unmake the wish, and Vi would come back all rotted and mouldering to stand at the end of my bed, belt in her hand with maggots chewed through her cheeks. I worried about that, but I never said anything. After a few months, the fear just sort of went away. Nobody knew. I wasn't going to get caught or arrested or anything, so I just kept it to myself as a little secret. After a while, I stopped thinking about it as a bad deed altogether. In fact, I started to get excited about the next birthday. I know it sounds horrible and wrong, but every time someone annoyed me, treated me unfairly, or punished me, I'd think about the birthday wish that was coming up, about this power that I had, and it made me feel excited. Wherever someone crossed me, even with the sort of trivial stuff that counts as a problem when you're 9, I'd think, "Be careful, mate, you don't know what I could do to you." The thought of it was, I don't know, it was good. I suppose you'd say intoxicating if you wanted to get all fancy about it, but obviously I didn't know that when I was 9. I just thought it made me strong, powerful. I thought the same when I turned 10. As she said this, I felt my eyes drawn to the second picture. It was an image of a young boy, no more than a teenager. Doris didn't explain. There was no account of his crime, what he had done to cross her, or why she had chosen to take vengeance. Only a nod.
I was 15 before the guilt started to set in. By that time I'd wished away 5 people. Killed them, just by blowing out a candle. By that point, though, I knew it wasn't a coincidence. It was a power I clearly had, and something I could choose to do if I wanted to. But I also realized that I wasn't obliged to. that I didn't have to wish for that. So instead, that year, I wished that Arnold Parnell, the lad I had a crush on, would kiss me. Later that night at the pictures, he did. He was dead by the morning.
Again, I leant forward in my chair and only managed at the last second to resist the urge to ask a question.
After that, I stopped wishing for a bit. I never even had a birthday cake. If I could help it and nobody found out, I'd skip my birthday altogether. Problem is, it doesn't help. I can't explain the logic of it. The later people aren't ones I had a grudge against, or even people I didn't like. Sometime in my mid-20s, I started to think that maybe it was someone I'd had bad thoughts about, or maybe the person I'd had the most bad thoughts about between birthdays, as if there was someone somewhere keeping score, like a tally. So then, I'd try having bad thoughts about really bad people, people I'd seen on the news and who probably deserved to die, but it didn't work like that. Later, I started to think it was only people I knew personally, someone in my orbit. The closest I can get to applying logic is that it's someone that I've thought about that day, the day of my birthday. Now, the obvious answer is, well, make sure you don't think about anyone you love or who you like, but that doesn't work. Have you ever tried to not think about someone or something? If I say to you, don't think about orange penguins, what's the first thing that pops into your head? You can't help it. Through most of my 30s, I was mourning. People close to me, people I loved, they died, one by one a year. I didn't wish, didn't ask for it, and I tried my best not to think about them, but it was no use. I remember on my 40th birthday that the one brother I had still living pointed out the pattern, that people seemed to have passed away on my birthday for successive years. He said he'd noticed it years ago, but I'd never had the courage to mention it before. That's him there.
She pointed to what I assumed was around the 30th photo.
He died that night of a heart attack. In my 40s, I made it more deliberate. To start with, I thought I could save the people I loved if I focused my attention and just thought on one person. But then, like you say, that means pretty much selecting someone or picking them out for death. In the end, I decided if I was going to do that, I should do it proper. I had to be sure. So I bought myself a cake, the right number of candles, and blew them all out in one go. I did that for 25 years, one a year, picking and choosing amongst my friends and acquaintances. It was horrible. Sometimes I tried to pick people I hardly knew because it wouldn't make me feel as bad, but then I worried that if they were too distant or too passing an acquaintance, just someone you'd nod to on the bus but whose name you didn't really know, then it wouldn't work. I was scared that whoever it was that I wished to that first time, whoever I did my little deal with, would take one of my loved ones instead. So I was dead deliberate, calculated and cold. I had little notebooks where I would write notes to come up with my decision. Who was likely to live longest, who had the least friends or family who would be hurt by their loss? One year I really regret, I purposely went out with the intention of making a friend. I went out the day after my birthday to a church coffee morning, picked this one fella from amongst the crowd and befriended him, knowing that as soon as he showed some interest and agreed to be my friend, he'd have just less than a year to live. I only did that once. I've tried knocking myself out on my birthday and all, drinking till I pass out or taking enough sleeping tablets to knock out a horse and sleeping right through the entire day. Problem is, when I do that, I dream. Then I've got no control. But last year, for the first time in 70-odd years, nobody got hurt. So I'm at least going to try. You probably think I'm a horrible person,
she muttered finally, raising herself to stand and waving me back into my seat when I instinctively began to rise to help her.
You either don't believe me, or you do and you think I'm horrible. I'll tell you, though, I used to say to myself that I'd never killed anyone who wasn't going to die eventually anyway. You never really save a life, you just prolong it and put off death. I chose the time, but I suppose nobody makes it out alive anyway, so where's the harm? You can hate me or judge me or whatever, but I've already been punished more than enough. I've lived with guilt for longer than I'd care to remember. You're probably wondering why I'm telling you all this either way. probably think I'm going balmy or that I've got dementia or something. Well, I haven't. I'm telling you for 3 reasons.
Doris liked to break things into 3s.
First, because I had to tell someone. I just had to. It's been 70-odd years, and telling you feels like I'm having the weight lifted for the first time. Second, and this is the horrible one, because I can't guarantee it won't be you, unless I wish on someone else. I might not. I've got a cake and a candle ready in case. Most likely I'll knock myself out and hope for the best, but I thought it was worth giving you fair warning in case you want to say any goodbyes on the off chance.
She was half shuffling, half stumbling around the bed now, and had come to stand almost beside me.
And in the end, more than anything, I just wanted you to know why I want to be left on my own tomorrow. Don't want to see or think about anyone. I think that's probably safest. Can you do that for me? Please?
Without saying a word, I reached into my bag and produced the 3 Tupperware boxes I had prepared for her. "Breakfast, dinner, and tea," I said. "Nobody's coming in on Wednesday. I've had a word with the warden, and she's fine with it as long as you promise to pull the cord if you need anything." Doris shuffled around to my side of the bed and, wrapping her hands around my entire head, pulled it close to her chest.
I love you, you know. I mean that. I never had kids because, well, I couldn't risk it, could I? But you, darling, you're...
I nodded that I understood. Then I watched as she shuffled into the living room. I followed her through, put the kettle on, and we continued the rest of the day as normal, as if the strange conversation had never even happened. That night I called both of my siblings and my parents just to let them know that I loved them. I tried to tell myself that I wasn't convinced by Doris's story, but I decided to call them anyway, just in case. The following morning I did my rounds with a different resident and never mentioned Doris once. When I came on shift the next day, it was as if a bomb had gone off. People were running around, frantically rushing from one place to the next, nobody stopping for a moment to clarify what was going on. Eventually, I managed to grab Priyanka by the arm and get some clarity.
"It's all gone off overnight," she said, shaking her head. "Mr. Warboys in number 22 died in the night, so the people from the hospital and his family have been here all morning, and to add to that, your mate in number 19 has gone walkabout. Just vanished like a bloody magician into a puff of smoke. God knows where she's gone or how she got out."
Turning from her, I hurried toward Doris's flat. When I got there, the warden was standing outside and the door was wide open. Walking past her without saying a word, I looked first in the living room, then in the bedroom. The photographs were still there, though now, in the final place, there was a photograph of John Warboys. It was a portrait we'd had done the previous summer, and which had been taken down from the residence wall, frame and all, and placed on the bed. That was 12 years ago. The home never did locate Doris. The police were called and she was reported missing, but they had no joy. I told them the story she had told me, and whilst they tried to be polite, they couldn't help looking at me as if I should probably be under supervision myself. I never found out who sent the blank birthday card. I don't know if Doris knew who had sent it, or if she received a similar card every year. What I do know is this. In mid-April of last year, I received a letter from a solicitor telling me that I had been named as the beneficiary in a will, and that I should come to his offices to discuss the last will and testament of Miss Doris Langdon. As the sole beneficiary, I don't mind saying that I came into quite a considerable sum of money. Within the will, which the solicitor read aloud in clipped, dulcet tones, was a short note saying that I could claim the entire amount on my next birthday. "Consider this," the solicitor read. "A birthday gift from, well, she's written Dora, but the whole thing is signed Doris, so I think she must have been a little confused toward the end," he added, never spotting our private joke. When I said I had been unaware that Doris had such wealth behind her, the solicitor smiled. He explained that Doris had only herself come into the money a year ago. Apparently, she had spent the last decade down south married to a man named Clive, who was extremely well off, and who had made her the sole beneficiary of his own will. It's strange, but Clive passed away almost a year to the day before she did. Come to think, it might actually have been the exact same day. When I asked if he knew anything of the circumstances surrounding Doris's death, he gave me a peculiar look, but finally explained that it's all rather odd, really. She was found in her home, lying on top of a perfectly made bed, surrounded by photographs. They found her on the 15th or 16th, but it's likely that she actually passed away on what would have been her 100th birthday. Strange to say, but when they found her, she was holding a tiny little cupcake on her chest, with one single, slightly melted candle sticking out of the top. It's an odd idea, but maybe a century was enough, and that going out that way was her birthday wish, he added dryly. Maybe you're right, I replied quietly. Maybe. This has been The Birthday Girl, a short horror story. Written by Stories from the Attic. Narrated by Robin McConnell. Copyright 2023 by Michael Vandervoort. Production copyright by Michael Vandervoort. Tapping on Glass, a short horror story. Written by Stories from the Attic. Narrated by Robin McConnell. When I first told my friends about the knocking, all they did was laugh. Initially, they listened intently, nodding along and straining to hear over the rowdy shouts and clink of glasses in the pub, but as the story went on, something changed. They began, with sly smiles, to share knowing glances across the table, smirking and sighing, one or two tutting loudly, before one of them finally decided to state the obvious by announcing what the rest of them were already thinking. "We've heard this one before, mate." The speaker was Mike, one of my oldest and closest friends. He said the words whilst throwing a handful of peanuts into his mouth and washing it down with a large gulp from his drink, as if trying to stop up his mouth so that no more words would escape. Perhaps, I thought, he felt insensitive about cutting my story off so dismissively, like it was an old joke too often told. Honestly, though, he had no reason to feel bad. Not only was it a fair comment, but it was also precisely what everyone else was thinking. The story was familiar. In fact, I had also heard the story, or at least the version they expected me to tell, many times before. That first night, I could understand the laughter, though of course my story would turn out to be very different, with a far more sinister ending. Far more sinister and, tragically, far more real. In the usual version, in the story they expected me to tell, a man is woken in the night by the persistent sound of knocking, tapping, like the hard rap of knuckles against a solid surface. At first he thinks he's imagining it, but when the rapping continues, he is eventually forced, with an exasperated sigh, to throw back the blankets and leave the comfort of his bed to investigate. It can't be the front door, he thinks. Why would anyone knock when he clearly had a doorbell? Especially at this hour of the night, or rather, early morning? Padding barefoot along the hall without ever bothering to switch on the light, he hears the sound again and decides to look, despite his earlier assumptions that, yes, it must be the front door. He checks his watch and sees that the time is 3:25 a.m. He approaches the door, ready to swing it open and berate whoever might be calling on him at such a stupid hour, when, instead, he hesitates. Standing before the door, he listens once again. Now there is no knocking. In fact, there is no sound at all. No sign of movement from outside, just the heavy press of silence and darkness against the wood. For the first time, our hero begins to feel uneasy. Who, he thinks to himself, would choose to call on him in the middle of the night? What sort of person was he likely to find waiting on the other side of that closed door, if indeed they were still there? Would it be more or less worrying to find someone standing there at 3 a.m.? Perhaps some hooded figure that doesn't speak but simply waits. Or perhaps no one at all. To open the door and find only a blank space with no sign that anyone had ever been there. What would he do, he thinks, if he opened the door to find nobody standing, but instead a shape at the end of the corridor, moving and crawling on all fours slowly towards him? Dismissing these ideas as stupid, he eventually works up the courage to open the door and finds, as expected, nothing. A wall of empty darkness. As he closes the door and turns back into the house, shaking his head and ready to return to bed, dismissing the whole thing as the remnants of a dream, he hears the tapping again. Tap, tap, tap. This time it comes from the window. Turning his head slowly, he looks towards it, the pane of glass covering most of the wall of the front room. He looks to the thick black drapes drawn in front of it to keep out the cold that chills the glass and seeps slowly into the room. He waits for a moment, then hears the sound again. Tap, tap, tap. Moving slowly towards the window, knowing that what he is hearing isn't possible, he stands inches from the curtains and again hesitates, terrified to pull them back, as he hears again the tap, softer now and gentler. Tap, tap, tap. As a low, female voice whispers, "Let me in, child. You have to let me in." The man turns and runs, not because the thought of a woman hunched up on his windowsill scares him, or because he is terrified by the thought of a strange visitor in the middle of the night, but because he knows he heard the voice, knows that there was and is someone on the other side of that curtain, despite the fact that our hero lives on the 27th floor. It was this same story, an old urban myth, retold in many different versions, that my other friend Davy unspooled for everyone that night in the pub when I first mentioned the knocking. "Come off it, mate," he said when he finished, jeering with a half-scoffed laugh. "We've all heard it before." I smiled in return, a weak, forced smile, one that recognized that they were probably right, that the old story was well worn and threadbare by now, that everyone had heard it, and that me repeating it came across as a weak attempt to frighten them. Still, it didn't stop the original story from being creepy, nor did it change the fact, the horrible, gnawing truth, that my version was true. I had heard the tapping, for each of the past 5 nights, a soft, gentle rapping on the glass of my windows. It didn't stop the fact that I was, frankly, terrified. I had moved into my apartment around a week before I first mentioned the knocking to my mates. Unlike the man in the old story, my apartment was only on the 11th floor, but still high enough that there should be nobody knocking at the windows. Had I lived on the ground floor, I might perhaps have dismissed the knocking as a joke. Some kids on their way home playing a practical joke. Had I been on the 3rd floor, I might still have entertained the idea. It wouldn't take much for someone to use a broom handle or 2 tied together to reach up and tap at a seemingly impossible height, freaking out the occupants before running away. But the 11th floor? Surely that was impossible. Had there been people above me, I might have suspected them. Imagined that they would lean out of their own window and tap on the glass with a long pole to freak out the new occupant below by making it seem that someone had come up to that level to knock. That would have seemed plausible, but there was no upstairs. My apartment was the top floor. The knocking should have been impossible, yet there it was, every night, around the same time. Tap, tap, tap. For the first 2 nights after I moved in, everything had been perfectly normal. The boiler had taken a while to come on and work properly because the apartment had been empty for almost 12 months, so the plumbing system hadn't been used in a while. Once I got it working, though, ran the taps and shower for a while to get any stagnant water out of the system, it seemed to be working fine. If I'm honest, there may well have been tapping on those first nights, but I wouldn't have noticed. Either I'd have been sound asleep, or I'd have assumed that it was something to do with the plumbing and gone back to sleep as soon as I heard it. It was only on the 3rd night that I noticed, and even then, only because my dog, Tito, had noticed it first. When I first got Tito, a small French bulldog with a crushed-up nose and a bark that was more of a half-strangled yelp, he had slept in his basket. My parents, who I was living with at the time, had insisted at first that the dog wasn't even allowed up the stairs. Over time, though, that changed. First, Tito made his way lazily up the stairs and began sleeping on the landing, in a spot of carpet in front of my bedroom door. Initially, I thought he'd chosen that spot out of some sense of duty or loyalty, because he wanted to protect or be close to me. I later realized that his preferred spot was the exact point that the hot water pipes ran beneath, meaning that the floor was warm, and Tito was actually just enjoying the equivalent of underfloor heating. Gradually, over the course of the next few months, I found that if I left my door open, the mangy mutt would slip into my room and sleep on the rug beside my bed. Eventually, after almost a year of slow burn stealth tactics, he found his way onto my bed, and I would let him stay, though any time my mother would catch him there she would go ballistic. Now that I was going to be living alone with Tito, and was able to make my own rules about where he was and wasn't allowed to sleep, I invited him onto the bed on the first night and intended to let him sleep there permanently, or at least until I got myself a lady friend to share the bed with instead, at which point I assumed Tito would understand. On that 3rd night, the night the tapping started, I had been fast asleep until, in the middle of the night, I felt Tito suddenly jerk upright and stiffen. He did not bark or whine in any way as he might if someone was in the house or had knocked at the door, but he had suddenly been roused to attention, his ears, usually flat against his head, standing straight up like 2 little pyramids as he stared straight ahead. Rolling over, I patted the bed for him to lie down, assuming that he had been dreaming, but just as I turned, I heard it, a faint but persistent tap. At first I didn't move. The room was pitch black, with the only light being the pale green glow from my alarm clock. It cut through the dark, allowing me to make out Tito's silhouette, ears raised to attention, reflected in the wall mirrors that were attached to the cupboards along the length of one wall. When I'd sent my friends photos of the house and they'd seen this mirrored wall, there had been a lot of jokes about how I might put it to use once I got myself a girlfriend. At that moment, though, I wished the cupboards had come without mirrors, and I found myself wishing for bare wood. Staying stock still in bed, I propped myself up on my elbows. Barely breathing, holding each breath to stifle the sound, I listened to see if the noise would come again. It did. Tap, tap, tap. Without making a sound, Tito leapt from the bed and skittered out toward the living room as if that were the source of the noise. I, meanwhile, was less enthusiastic about investigating and instead decided to listen. The sound came again. For a moment I considered whether the sound might be coming from the pipes, something to do with the boiler getting back into action, but I soon decided that it wasn't the case. The sound was not metallic or muffled under layers of floorboards and brick, as the dull thud of plumbing noises tended to be. This sound was sharp, with a resonant echo behind it. It was less a tap and more of a knock. The sound, I recognized almost immediately, of knuckles against a hard surface. I instantly thought of the story, of the old woman knocking, wanting to be let in at a window 30 stories up. Tap, tap, tap. Hearing the noise again, I had to admit that it sounded far less like the rapping of a fist on wood, as it would have been if someone was knocking on the front door, than it did like the sound of tapping on glass. There was something about the echo, the way it seemed to pool around the initial sound in a low, muttered thunk, that had to be glass, but of course that was impossible. Easing myself reluctantly from the bed, I walked toward the living room. Unlike the guy in the story, however, I was sure to flip the lights on first. What I found there was Tito, sitting, his ears pricked up, tail stationary as if frozen in expectation. He was staring dead ahead, his attention fixed on the drawn curtains at the front of the house. At the front living room window. I felt my stomach tighten as the sound came again. Tap, tap, tap. It seemed gentler now, softer, as if whomever was making the sound had realized that they no longer needed to wake me, but just to bring me closer, easing and winding me in, slowly, as a spider would a fly on lengths of silken thread. For almost a minute I didn't move. Instead, I remained perfectly still. Tito similarly was frozen in place by my side and had not moved a muscle since I'd entered the room. We both glared at the curtain. Was it my imagination, I thought, or was the fabric of that curtain, the fall of the material, slightly bulging outward, arcing slightly into the room as if rested gently against the shape of a figure? My mind flashed back to my childhood days, to games of hide-and-seek when I would hide from my sister by standing behind the curtain, pushing myself as far back against the wall as I could so as not to create a ripple at the front or a bulge or shape that would give me away. Looking now at the thick, cream-coloured curtains hanging heavily across the glass and covering the window that made up almost the entire front wall of the apartment, I remembered the times she had tried it, when I had found her not because she made a noise, but because there was something strange about the lay of the curtain, a crest or bump that shouldn't have been there. I checked the surface of the curtain again, noting how on one side, the left, the material lay perfectly flat, whilst on the other it seemed to yawn outward in the middle before falling away, like the gentle curve of a hill, a place where snow has blanketed the earth but cannot conceal its outline. I looked toward the ground, wondering as I did what I might do if, after allowing my gaze to drop past the length of fabric, the join and the seam, I was to see in the shadow below a pair of mouldering feet. Dead feet, the bottoms purplish-black, the skin moist and grey with cold, the seeping, buried cold of soil beneath the ground. What if those feet, bloated and swollen with moisture, were standing there with curved yellowing toenails below the shield of curtain? Even as I looked, my mind raced and scurried, darting and ferreting into corners of memory, dragging up images and ideas that I really didn't need. Facts about how the nails and hair appear to grow even after death, but how this is actually just an illusion created by the skin slowly tightening. Memories of tales by M.R. James, faces formed in crumpled linen. Finally, Tito barked and, spurred on by his action, in one swift, determined movement, I strode forward, grasped the curtain, and yanked it quickly back. Seeing the face staring back with a grimace of revulsion and terror almost gave me a heart attack. Reeling backward in an attempt to get away, I stumbled awkwardly on the rug, tripped over the dog, and fell with a heavy, tumbling thump back onto the floor. Gawping up, I stared in abject horror as I realized all at once that the face I had seen was my own. It was me, reflected in the glass. As Tito, excited by the movement and my falling over, barked furiously at the cold glass window, I shook my head and laughed. What an idiot, I thought, knowing even then that this part of the story would be missing when I related the tale to the lads in the pub. Raising myself up, I clambered to my feet just in time to hear the sound again. Tap, tap, tap. Glaring at my own reflection in the window, I again felt the ice in my belly. Yes, I had been startled, and yes, it had been stupid to be afraid of my own reflection, but that didn't change the fact that the sound had been there. It also didn't change the fact that the sound was undeniably someone tapping on glass. Now, I had a choice. For whilst I could see my own stupid self reflected in the glass, that also meant that I could see nothing outside. As long as I could see the room reflected back at me, that would be all I'd see. But if I flipped the switch, if I turned off the light and plunged the room into darkness, I would either see the building opposite, cold, still, and mundane, staring back at me, or I would see, crouched upon the window-sill, the thin and tattered form of whatever wanted to come in. The withered old hag, knees pulled up to her chest, strands of straggling hair matted to her face as she grinned, toothlessly, maniacally, perching on the window-sill and tapping upon the glass. Darkness, usually so careful to guard its secrets, would reveal everything it had to show, no matter how terrible or impossible it might be. Cautiously, I rose to my feet, leaned toward the light switch, and allowed my finger to rest upon it. The rational, adult, and logical part of my brain was screaming at me. It was reminding me how stupid it was to be afraid of the dark, how childlike and absurd my reluctance would look if anyone else could see. But, of course, there was nobody to see. Nobody there at all. That was part of the problem. If I did flip the switch, and there was something there, then I would be alone with it, in the dark. I flipped the switch. The room went black and Tito began to bark. An empty street cropped like a picture by the frame of the window. From across the street, a slate-grey building, all concrete and banality, stared directly back at me in silent, cold indifference. This is the version of the story that I'd been telling that first night, when the lads had cut me off and dismissed my story as an urban myth. When I insisted that whilst I could see the similarities, there had been a noise, they joked, that perhaps it was a pigeon tapping its beak on the window. "Or maybe an owl. After all, it was at night," cried Mike as the whole group laughed. The sequel to my story wouldn't come until a fortnight later, by which time nobody was laughing, especially Mike. The tapping had continued, though less frequently than before, and having finally convinced myself, or at least convinced myself to pretend, that it was probably a problem with the pipes, a problem that I'd eventually get a plumber to look at, I succeeded in ignoring it. Almost. The problem was Tito. Every time the tapping came, he would jolt awake and alert. On some occasions he would even sprint into the other room, expecting me to follow. Which, of course, I didn't. Because, I told myself, the whole thing was stupid, a problem with the pipes. It wasn't that I was scared, I'd tell myself. It was just stupid, that's all. So I stayed in bed and let Tito pursue the sound himself. Part of me wishes now that I had followed him, but another part is glad and grateful that I didn't. One night, around 2 weeks after I'd first told my friends about the knocking, the sound came again, and, to me, seemed louder than ever. Right on cue, Tito had his usual reaction, stiffening up and rising to attention before leaping from the bed and scrambling into the other room in pursuit of someone who I told myself wasn't there. Whilst I had no intention of following the daft mutt into the living room, his actions had woken me up, alerting me to the fact that my bladder was full and that, despite my best efforts to ignore that quirk of the plumbing, I would be forced to get out of bed and take myself off for a pee. Having done what was necessary, I began making my way back to the bedroom and called to Tito, expecting him to come snuffling obediently behind me. But Tito never came. When I called again, he didn't come. I reasoned that he must have become fixated on something in the other room. Stupid dog, I remember thinking as images of him pulling over the lamps or attacking the curtains forced me to turn around and shuffle, in my boxer shorts, slowly back toward the living room, where Tito would no doubt be growling at the sofa or some other imagined horror. Only he wasn't there growling, because Tito was no longer there. I called him and checked behind the sofa and in the other rooms, convinced that he hadn't passed me on the way. I went back to the bedroom, opened the cupboards, and then made my way back to the living room, but he was nowhere to be found. After a few minutes of desperate searching, calling his name and looking in the most ridiculous of places, I began to panic. I looked inside cupboards he couldn't have opened, in the barrel of the washing machine, and even in the fridge in case he had somehow managed to crawl inside. After about an hour, I was not only panicking, but questioning my own sanity. The doors were locked, the windows were closed and bolted. He had to be somewhere in the apartment. He had to be, and yet he wasn't. I checked the exits again, even pulling up bits of carpet to make sure he hadn't burrowed through gaps in the floorboards. Still, there was no sign. Tito had vanished. As you might imagine, I didn't sleep at all that night. The following morning, I called my landlord and told him I wanted to get out of the arrangement. Since I had made the arrangements through a friend, moved in early, and hadn't actually signed the contracts, he was surprisingly okay with it, so long as I covered the next month's rent whilst he found someone to replace me. That night I met my friends in the pub, including Mike, who had originally hooked me up with the landlord, and told them what had happened to Tito. This time, nobody laughed. Whilst they found the situation hard to believe, one of them insisting over and over that I must have left a window open, they all realized how devastating the loss was for me, however it had come about. One said that the setup reminded him of an Edgar Allan Poe story, or was it Sherlock Holmes? How could the dog have escaped from a totally sealed room? He mused. Oddly, even then, I doubted that Tito had escaped. If he'd got out, If he had somehow, like the Houdini of canines, managed to push open a locked door or window and then seal it up again from the inside, then fine. But what then? Dogs, especially dogs like Tito, don't just take themselves on wanders never to return. Most of the time they come back to familiar ground, back to where their owners live, or the last place they remember being. Tito hadn't come back, but then I had no explanation for where he might have gone in the first place, until I spoke with Mike. Particularly quiet throughout the conversation and for the rest of the night, Mike had seemed out of sorts from the moment I mentioned Tito, and, unusually for him, had even gone home early, saying that he felt under the weather and that he would call us the next day. He did call me, though it wasn't to arrange a meet-up. Over the phone, Mike told me about the woman who had lived in the apartment before me. It was through him and his previous job working as an estate agent that I had got the flat in the first place.
"Thing is,"
he said, his voice a low, croaking whisper,
"the woman who was there before, she went a bit mental."
Jesus, I thought. Here comes the creepy ghost story about the previous tenant being some kind of axe murderer who came back to haunt the place. I suggested this to Mike and tried to laugh the idea off, but Mike was having none of it. He was deadly serious.
"It isn't like that, mate,"
he muttered solemnly.
"This woman, she went a bit mad after her daughter went missing. Thing is, about a month before her daughter vanished, she told Garrett, your landlord, that her dog had gone missing as well, from a locked house."
I felt the hair on my neck stand on end.
"I mean, we all thought she was mad, but she swore that the dog had been left in all day with all the doors and windows shut, just like you and Tito. She said there was no way it could have got out, so somebody must have been in the apartment. She made Garrett change all the locks and everything."
What? I bawled down the phone. And you never bothered to tell me this? There was a pause.
"I didn't want to freak you out. I mean, you don't believe in that mumbo-jumbo, so I didn't think it would have bothered you anyway. It was only when you started talking about the knocking that I felt weird, but I didn't want to scare you. You know, put daft ideas in your head."
What kind of ideas? I asked before adding tentatively, "What happened to her daughter, Mike?" There was a long pause, and for a second I wondered if Mike was even still there. Then he spoke.
"You see, now, that's the thing,"
he began.
"According to her story, it was the same as the dog. The kid vanished from the apartment, even though all the doors and windows were locked, with brand new locks too. Difference was, this time, she saw what happened."
Mike paused, as if considering for a moment whether to go on with the story, before suddenly deciding to go all in and tell me.
"It was the knocking, you see. She'd heard it just like you said, right in the middle of the night, like a hand knocking on glass. She'd gotten out of bed and walked into the living room to check, but there was nobody there. She opened the door, checked the front window, nothing. So she turned around and went back to her room, but as she did, she stuck her head into her daughter's room, just to check on her, you know."
I said that I knew what he meant.
"She said that when she looked in, her daughter was sitting up on the edge of her bed. At first she wondered what the hell she was doing and thought maybe she'd been the one tapping on the windows. But as she looked in, she realized the sound wasn't someone tapping on the window. They were tapping on the mirror. Tapping on it. From the other side."
Again, Mike paused. His voice had begun to shake and crack as he spoke, but he coughed to clear his throat and continued.
"The woman said that as she looked, she could see her daughter sitting there, and opposite, in the upright mirror, attached to the cupboard door, she could see the reflection. The girl and the room, but that wasn't all. She said that in the reflection there was something else. She said it was tall. Well, she called it a stretched person. Twig thin, with everything too long. She said it had no features, but it was dark like a shadow, and it was knocking, slowly, rapping on the glass with these thin, big, knuckly hands, knocking to get the girl to come. She said that she screamed, but before she could move forward to scoop up her daughter and carry her away, it had her. A hand, leathery brown and massive, covered in curls of coarse black hair, reached out through the mirror. She said it gripped her daughter by the top of the head, that it had talons, and they clamped on the skull like one of those claw games you play in arcades, trying to win a soft toy. She said that she rushed forward, but it pulled and yanked the girl, lifting her off the bed, across the room and up against the mirror, then through it, to God knows where.
I didn't know what to say.
They never found the girl. She was reported missing, and for a while they wanted to charge the mum, but without a body to speak of and no real evidence of a crime, what could they charge her with? She ended up being committed because she wouldn't stop screaming about the thing in the mirror and the mirror people, saying that she could hear them knocking all the time, wanting to be let in. She said that they come to the mirrors to look in on us, to hunt us, the way we look into the surface of water for fish, creatures that never know until it's too late about the world outside the water, on the other side of the surface. She said they'd snatched her dog as well, dragged it through the mirror and ate it, but I don't know how she knew that part. Anyway, I didn't tell you because you had a good deal. I didn't want to put you off and—
He trailed off before adding finally.
Poor Tito.
Yeah, I said in response. Poor Tito. I never found out what happened to my dog. A week after my chat with Mike, I moved into a ground-floor apartment. It has 2 bedrooms, a large living room, and not a single mirror. This has been Tapping on Glass, a short horror story, written by Stories from the Attic, narrated by Robin McConnell, copyright 2023 by Michael Vandervoort, production copyright by Michael Vandervoort. Shades of Autumn, a short horror story, written by Stories from the Attic, narrated by Robin McConnell. It was some time around the 2nd week of April that Julian began turning green. At first, he said it had started as a rash, a bunch of broken capillaries in his hands and on his forearms that spread in spidery networks across his skin. At first, he'd hardly noticed. On his pale, virtually translucent skin, the veins often showed up as a roadmap of overlapping lines, standing out starkly in shades of pale blue. But this, the odd, greenish tinge like the shadow of a fading bruise, was different. At first, we tried to explain it away. Clearly it was either stress, paint, or a reaction to them both. The first of these factors, the impact of stress, was a common problem for Julian. We all knew he had a big exhibit coming up, that the pressure on him to produce was building, and that on each previous occasion when he'd been under that sort of stress, the lack of sleep, creeping anxiety, and overindulgence in alcohol had manifested itself physically. One time it was irritable bowel syndrome, the streaks of crimson he found on the tissue when he went to the bathroom scaring him senseless and only serving to increase his anxiety. Another time it was migraines, crippling headaches that would not be subdued by the usual painkillers and which would be accompanied by spots of colour floating into his field of vision, the pain rendering him unable to work, which once again only served to increase his anxiety. On almost every occasion he would enter his studio ready to work at a reasonable weight and come out just before the big show looking emaciated, as if he'd eaten virtually nothing the entire time he was working, so that the only thing he managed to feed was his anxiety. In every case, the symptoms of his anxiety eventually became causes of anxiety themselves. self-fulfilling prophecies in twists of vicious cycles. On previous occasions, the doctors, of course, recommended rest. In the short term, he needed sleep and stress reduction, and in the long term, an environment devoid of stress and pressure. Unfortunately for Julian, as an artist who only got paid for the work that he sold, an environment with a lack of stress and pressure was also an environment with a lack of payment. Rest in the short term meant poverty and starvation in the long term. Of course, less sympathetic friends would claim that the solution was obvious: give up being an artist and get a so-called proper job. It was a solution that Julian not only considered, but actually tried out a few times, attempting on several occasions to get other, more normal jobs. He spent several months working as a barista in a local coffee shop and even once took a job as a teller at a bank. Again, though, his anxiety got the better of him. For Julian, customer-facing roles in which he was called upon to speak to strangers were torture, his nerves threatening to turn him inside out every time he had to interact with someone. He would get cold sweats, panic attacks, and would sometimes simply walk off shift without explanation when it all got too much, which of course wasn't good for his long-term career progression. He tried freelance work, jobs he could pick up online and which would not involve dealing with people. Whilst the jobs he did get worked well for him in terms of the work required, they did not pay well, meaning that the money required, chiefly to pay for things like food and rent, meant this solution didn't work either. The jobs were less stressful, sure, but the pressure on his finances increased his anxiety almost as much as the jobs requiring interaction. So he went back to his art. At least with painting he was stress-free for the majority of time. For each painting he sold, he would make the equivalent to 2 months of pay from either of the other job paths he explored, which meant in the time between exhibits, when he wasn't required to actually sell anything and was free to just work on his art, he was stress-free and healthy. So he continued to paint. He once explained this decision by comparing himself to a surfer. When painting, he could enjoy the times when the sea was calm and flat, and prepare himself mentally and physically for the times when the anxiety would peak and crest, and the time to submit his work approached. When I pointed out that surfers hated calm water and actually enjoyed riding the big waves, he just shrugged. "I tried things the normal way," he said. "This isn't perfect, but it is better." That day in April, around 3 weeks from the opening of his new exhibit, I could see that he was beginning to climb the crest of a new wave. Not yet so stressed that he would really feel it, but anxious enough to feel the deadline looming like a dark cloud over him, the weight of the pressure pushing so hard onto his shoulders that, inexplicably, it turned him green. When he first walked into the cafe that day, I assumed that the strange tint was a result of the paint he had been using, or perhaps a trick of the light caused by the layer of terps and linseed oil that permanently permeated his skin. On closer inspection, however, it was clear that the colour was below the surface of the skin, and was only apparent because of how pale Julian was otherwise. Having noticed it in the first few minutes, and worried that it could be some kind of contamination or poisoning related to components in his paint, I didn't waste any time in addressing the strange tinge, and asked him about it directly. He said that he had noticed it, but that he wasn't particularly worried. "I like green," he said, as if the transformation was the most normal thing in the world. It was a strange quirk of Julian's already strange character that, whilst he was terrified of things like talking on the phone or speaking to cashiers in the supermarket, things like turning a completely different colour didn't bother him in the slightest. It started, he said, a week or 2 earlier, first as a rash and then as slightly raised dots on his skin. He assumed it was something to do with what he was eating and mentioned something about flamingos turning pink because of the shrimp they eat. I pointed out that this wasn't normal, and that unless he was eating more grass than a particularly ravenous field full of cows, His food should not be turning him green. He nodded in non-committal agreement and tried to drop the subject. It was only when I insisted and made him promise that he agreed to visit a doctor. If it still looks like this in a week, then I'll go see the doctor. It's just, I've got a lot of work to do at the moment. Finding the time, you know? I shook my head and sighed. Had this been one of my other friends gradually changing colour, then I would have been surprised by their reluctance to visit the doctor, but this was Julian. As long as he got to paint uninterrupted, his new Bruce Banner tan was a concern for later. For him, it just wasn't a top priority. By the time I visited him a week later, though, it had become a far more pressing issue. Julian and I had been friends for many years, and by now it was almost tradition that in the final weeks before any big project, I would turn up to check on him, just to make sure he did other non-painting things like bathing and remembering to eat. Turning up to his studio with takeaway pizzas and boxes of cereal for the next morning, I let myself in, and was surprised to find my friend not before his easel as expected, but rather at the back of the studio, his t-shirt pulled up to shoulder height as he examined himself closely in the full-length mirror. There was a lot to examine. Catching one look at him, I dropped the pizzas heavily to the floor and rushed instead to the telephone. Within an hour, Julian, despite his protests, was in the back of an ambulance and on his way to the hospital. When he was taken into the examination room, Julian asked that I be allowed to accompany him, lying to the nurse and claiming that I was his brother. I followed Julian and the doctor into the room and will admit that I was a little unnerved by the way that even the nurses, like the paramedics before them, shrank back from him. Though, in retrospect, I suppose it was understandable. Walking in on Julian that afternoon had been quite a shock. Whereas the previous week he had displayed only a strange green tinge to his skin, now he was transformed. Across large areas of his body he had developed large pendulous appendages, polyps, that had, he said, begun as dark green skin tags, like warts or pimples, but which over the course of a week had swollen until they were each the size of a grape, though with the colour, shape, and leathery texture of a small avocado. They hung across the surface of his body, dozens from his fingers, a dozen from the ridges of his eyebrows, so that they dangled before his eyes, obscuring his vision. From his ribs and back, scores of these tiny nodules sprouted from his skin, hanging, bloated and swollen by their tapered, pear-like ends. How or why he had allowed the growths to get to this point was beyond me. All he would say was that he was busy, that he was doing some amazing work and that really he hadn't noticed. This I took to be a lie, especially as I had walked in on him examining himself in the mirror. Clearly, he had noticed. He had simply chosen not to do anything about it, to put it off for a while whilst he continued with his work. There are few things in life more disconcerting than presenting your symptoms to a medical professional and having them recoil open-mouthed at the sight of you. That experience would be bad enough for someone without anxiety. For Julian, it was tantamount to receiving a death sentence, and it took me almost 15 minutes to calm him down. Initially, the doctor was concerned that Julian's condition might be contagious and wanted to shoo me out of the room, but I refused. If it, whatever it was, happened to be contagious, then it was too damn late by now anyway, I insisted. Plus, I was not leaving Julian alone to cope with this, no matter what happened. Seeing that I was not going to move on this, he eventually folded and allowed me to stay, following along and holding my friend's hand whilst he was first examined, then tested, then admitted. Whilst we remained alone in the doctor's tiny office room, preliminary tests were performed on Julian's strange growths. Having determined that despite their strange colour they were composed of skin tissue, and through tests for bacteria, fungus, and viruses they were likely not contagious, The doctor returned to say that Julian would need to remain under observation whilst they established exactly what was going on. This, of course, elicited a great protest from Julian, who insisted that he had work to do and that time was running out. In the end, though, my insistence, backed by the doctor's, was both more aggressive and more final than his, the result being that he was moved to a small room which, whilst it was not technically an isolation area, was a good distance from any other patient and clearly chosen by the staff for its privacy. Julian was given a hospital bed, a revealingly backless gown, and was hooked up to a drip to combat what the doctor called acute dehydration. I had expected, with the worry about his condition, not to mention his misplaced concern about the time missed from painting, that Julian might be massively wired and unable to sleep. In fact, the exact opposite was true. No sooner had his head hit the pillow in the hospital bed than he had fallen into a deep slumber, leading me to suspect that this might be the first time he had actually laid down in days. I, meanwhile, remained awake all night, though it was not until the early hours of the morning that I began to notice the change, and rushed to alert one of the nurses. Around 4:30 a.m., I noticed a thin trickle of blood streaming down the left side of Julian's head. Alarmed by the fact that he was bleeding, I rose from my chair and saw immediately that the strange growths, particularly those hanging above Julian's eyebrows, had begun to detach, leaving small, leaking wounds around the size of a 5-pence piece behind them. Whilst this odd fact seemed not to faze the nurse, the sudden, abrupt drop in Julian's blood pressure did, and, to my alarm, he was rushed from the room and off to some other undisclosed location, whilst I was left to simply sit and wait. Over the course of the next 24 hours, 74 plum-sized growths, each of which had expanded in size whilst Julian had been in the hospital, simply fell from Julian's body. Some detached with hardly a mark, whilst others left wounds so large that they required a stitch to close, all of which is not to mention the fact that when Julian was finally returned to the room, I was told that he had required a transfusion, each of the growths having leached a small but not inconsiderable amount of blood from him before they simply fell away. Not that these procedures left Julian sick or even badly affected. He stayed in the hospital for what amounted to a total of 3 days, and by the time he left, he seemed to be in better health than I had seen him in for years. In fact, despite sporting so many small plasters all over the surface of his body that he looked like he'd been in the world's worst shaving accident, he positively bounded out of the place with the energy of a small puppy, insisting over and over that he felt amazing and that he should probably come for transfusions a little more often. He had received few answers from the doctors when they had told him that his growths would need to be sent away for tests. When I asked if he would be okay, now that he was 5 days behind schedule with his work, he just smiled broadly. "I have it all under control," he beamed. "I dunno, maybe it was getting some rest, or I dunno, but everything seems really clear now. Like a fog's lifted or something. I know exactly what I need to do, and I feel like I have tons of time to get it done. I'm healthy, I'm relaxed, I don't know, I feel great." He literally laughed these final words, and, I had to admit, seemed almost to glow as he shook my hand and pulled me in for a hug, thanking me over and over for sticking with him and making sure he was okay. I said no problem, and he kissed me on the cheek. "Okay," he said finally as we reached the door of his studio. "Once more into the breach. This is going to be good, mate. I can feel it." With that, he disappeared inside. I didn't see him again for almost a month. When I did see Julian again, it was at the launch of his exhibit. The show had opened to quite some fanfare, with great reviews and multiple sales of large pieces. In some ways, it was stunning that he had managed to produce so much work in such a short period of time. Clearly, he had been inspired. More surprising even than his success, however, was the marked change in his appearance. Julian looked like a new man. His scars had healed, he seemed to have gained weight in the form of muscle, as if he'd been furiously working out for the past year, never mind the last month. His skin looked clear and tan, his hair healthy and lustrous. Had I not known better, and had it not been physically impossible, I would have said he had a glow similar to that sometimes observed in pregnant women, which it turned out was a somewhat ironic comparison. Following the night of his opening, during which I saw him only briefly as he was required to mingle and circulate amongst the guests, something which he seemed to do with uncharacteristic confidence, Julian seemed to simply disappear. For the next 3 months, I heard not a single word from him. My other friends assured me that he was probably just working, locked away in his studio and up to his eyeballs, immersed in some new project. Other, less kind friends explained that Julian was a success now, that he had made a fortune from his last exhibit, had made new, rich, and important friends, and would probably never be seen with the likes of us again. This I found hard to believe. I called his phone, visited his studio, and even contacted his parents to ask after him, but was met with silence. Nobody had seen or heard from him in months. Then, one night in August, and seemingly out of the blue, I received a phone call asking me to meet him at his studio, to come along and to please hurry. I know that some would have balked at the idea, become angry or spiteful about their friend's absence and sudden need for attention, but that's not how things worked with us. It didn't matter to me that I hadn't seen him and that he hadn't called. What was important was that he needed me now. Without a moment's thought, I dropped my other plans and made my way there. Walking into the studio, I was struck by how intensely crowded the place was. Canvases covered every surface, piled and stacked in such a way that weaving through them was like being a giant weaving its way through the skyscrapers of some tiny city. Eventually, having wound my way through this maze of artwork, I found my friend. He was hunched, his back to me, a blanket draped over his shoulders and covering his head. Hearing my footsteps as I approached, he called for me to stop and wait. My first thought was that he had relapsed, that the same strange affliction that had befallen him months earlier had returned and that he would once again need to be rushed to the hospital. The last part of this assumption turned out to be true, though actually convincing him to go was another matter. As for his condition, there were no further growths, at least not of the kind we had seen before. This time, things were different. As he turned around to face me, it was clear that Julian was falling apart, literally. His skin, for want of a better word, had fractured. Across his face, bare chest and arms, the skin had hardened into large, scale-like plates, most of which burned in shades of red, amber, and yellow, like some kind of solid flame. In other places, toward the edge of each scale, the colour deepened to a deep umber, and then a chalky, almost ashen black. Around him on the bed, flakes of this skin, each the size of an outstretched hand, lay in brown, brittle piles that crumbled to dust when he moved. Worse still were the empty spaces, places and gaps where the skin was simply missing. Here it was possible to look right through, to see the bone beneath, and how it too had taken on a different hue, darkened to a rich nut brown. I remember that my eyes filled with tears, and I rushed forward to hold him, but he stopped me, the act of raising his hand sending fragments of what had once been skin splintering onto the bed. "Jane," he said, with obvious difficulty. "You can't help me," he moaned, each word mangled by his inability to form the sounds, the lips being pinned back as if dried onto the teeth like a thin film of gold leaf. I stood, hands dangling limp by my sides, my head shaking side to side, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. Turning to face me, lidless eyes rolling wildly in his head, Julian attempted to smile, and before he collapsed said only a single word. "Autumn," he whispered gently. Then he folded forward, asleep. It took me almost 5 minutes to wake him. When he came round, I told him not to worry, that an ambulance was on its way, but he insisted, screaming and wailing as if in agony, that I cancel the call, which I eventually, reluctantly, did. With a strained, laboured movement, he pointed to an upturned crate that he had clearly been using as a makeshift table, and to a letter that had been placed there. Lifting it, I read it several times, unable to fully comprehend what had been written. The letter was from the hospital, requesting that Julian make his way there as soon as possible. Evidently, tests on the growths removed from him had shown some extraordinary and unprecedented results. According to what was written, each growth was in fact something approaching a sac, inside of which, according to the doctors, there were around a dozen smaller fragments, which were best described as seeds. Indeed, our tests seemed to indicate that these smaller pieces contain almost 60% chlorophyll. As Julian moaned, I continued to read, skipping past the doctor's insistence that he return to the hospital immediately to the more ominous final sentences, the ones stating that they were watching closely because these seeds had begun to sprout. As I turned back toward my friend, who had in the short time I had been there withered even further, the reds and yellows began darkening and fading into brown. I watched as in minutes his muscles began to atrophy, seeming to slough and melt from the bone like leaves, falling red from the trees and rotting, trodden underfoot to a thick oozing mulch. Like autumn, I thought. I saw that again he was gesturing, this time not to the table but the paintings, dozens of them arranged around the room, some in hues of green, others in shades of russet and rust, the burnished colours of the fall. On the easel, centre stage and clearly placed there for some significant reason, was an image almost as terrifying as it was surreal. It depicted a man, arms outstretched in a pose reminiscent of Leonardo's Vitruvian Man. One side of the figure, however, was not flesh and bone, but rather bark. Where there should have been an arm, there was instead a stretching length of twigs, branches, and leaves that in a second image toward the centre of the canvas had begun, with the turn of the seasons, to die and rot, falling after a final flourish to piles of mulch below. A man, a person, a human being, cycling like the trees with the changing of the seasons, the green tint of spring, the flowering and seeding, the robust health of summer, and now... "What the hell is happening?" I shouted, turning back to where the remnants of my friend, skeletal and terrified, lay upon the bed. Staring up at me, wide-eyed and desperate, Julian pointed downward, down toward the legs, concealed by the blanket, and nodded for me to pull it back. Swallowing hard, I gripped the fabric and slowly revealed what lay below. Seeing not what should have been, a pair of legs and feet, but instead a writhing network of long, tenebrous roots. Seeing not what should have been, a pair of legs and feet, but instead a writhing network of long, tenebrous roots. I think I may have screamed. I may have shrieked in confusion and in terror, but eventually that subsided, and I realized that my friend, my true, close and unfortunate friend, was trying as best as he could to speak. Through lips that were almost no longer there, he hissed gently his final whispered wish, each syllable a long, agonized exhalation. "Bury me. Please, please, bury me. No, not when I die. Now, bury me now. Please, please." I don't know if I screamed, but I do know that I cried. The next day, up on the moor, the grassy expanse high above the town, I buried my best friend, alive. I carried him, light as a feather, brittle and fragile, from the studio and placed him, still wrapped in the blanket, onto the back seat of my car, scared that he might shatter or disintegrate on the way. Then I drove up to the moor and dug a hole, all the while hearing him thank me, saying over and over again that he loved me and that it was okay. Seasons change. Seasons change. Finally, as the sun began to rise, and as he continued slowly to nod, I placed him gently into the pit and covered his body with earth, watching as I did tiny tubular roots, thin tendrils like strands of hair, spread and reach into the soil, searching and scouring for anchor and purchase. I watched him as his eyes, white and round, stared directly up into the endless blue of the sky, and as what remained of his body went limp and still. Had he died, I wondered, or simply given himself up? Had he somehow taken root? I crossed myself, told him I loved him, and with one heavy shovelful of earth covered his face in dirt, trying as I did to reassure myself that I was burying my friend and not planting him. For 5 long months I visited that spot every day. I watched the ground harden with cold, watched the frost and snow cover the crime, only to thaw and show beneath new, persistent shoots of grass. It was only in March, almost a year since Julian had shown that strange green tinge, that something below the soil's surface began to shift and stir. A new shoot, ripe and green, pushed with purpose through the ground and out into the world above. For almost a month I watched it grow, rapidly from a shoot to a stem, then to a sapling, young but strong, filled in spring with potential and sap. At that point, I'd seen enough. Exactly what happened to Julian I doubt I'll ever know. I've read a bunch of theories. Greek myths of Daphne, who, pursued by Apollo, prayed for her father to save her by turning her into a laurel tree. I wondered what, if anything, was chasing Julian. By what did he feel so pursued that he would ever have prayed for this? I read on the net about strange experiments, gene splicing and grafting, about how you can fix a limb from one fruit tree to another and the branch will continue to grow, fruiting lemons, pears, or apples from the trunk of an orange tree. I read how this process was prized for military applications and how governments have tried to produce this effect in a number of human subjects, so far without success. I heard as well of the cordyceps fungus that sprays its spores into ants and wasps, taking root beneath the skin, penetrating the brain and finally controlling the mind. This fungus forces an ant to climb ever upward and cling to a branch as high as it can and wait until the fungus, growing through its flesh, sprouts through the top of the head and feeds on what remains. I read a lot of theories, but not a lot of answers. The contents of Julian's studio, all 90 paintings with their odd botanical twists, sold through his agent to private collectors in the months following his disappearance, all of them selling for far more than Julian would ever have earned when he was alive. All, that is, but one. The final piece that rested on the easel I took the same day I buried him and kept for my own collection, not because I liked to look at it, but because I hoped that one day it might help me understand, to make some sense of how my friend, like some strange tree in a species far removed from man, felt the seasons shift and change, crumpled and rotted, shedding his leaves as autumn gave way to winter. In truth, I shouldn't have taken the painting. It isn't like I needed it. The image it held I could see any time, burnt as if branded onto my eyes and mind. In the top quarter, a man slowly becoming a tree. In the second, that tree half shedding and losing its leaves. In the third, reduced, as Julian had been, to pulp, detritus, debris, and dust. I could also see, whenever I closed my eyes, the final quarter, nestled in that bottom corner, that painting of a strange and twisted plant, a seedling peeping up through the ground, a sapling that in place of a branch had sprouted instead a chubby, reaching cylinder of flesh, the tiny digits and pearl-drop nails of a baby's tiny arm. A month ago I moved away, packed my things and took a plane. I got a job in a far-off city on the other side of the world, a place where I intend to live out my days in a land that has no seasons. This has been Shades of Autumn, written by Stories from the Attic, narrated by Robin McConnell. Copyright 2023 by Michael van der Voort. Production copyright by Michael van der Voort.